Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm very, very happy to be here today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and some of the research that I discuss in the book. I'm going to sample a little bit from each of the three sections in the book. And then I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions. So if you have any questions, you can store them up. If they're burning questions and you have to get them out and you think that they will clarify what I'm saying, I'm also happy to take questions earlier on before the end of the talk. So I'm pretty flexible. From teaching, I'll take them whenever they come. So the title of the book is obviously a bit opaque if you don't know what Drunk Tank Pink is. So I'm going to explain what the title means in a minute. But I want to start first by talking about the subtitle, the bit after the Drunk Tank Pink. Unexpected forces that shape how we think, feel, and behave. So the basic idea here is that there are lots of metaphors for the human mind. I'm just going to use this one for the moment. And the way we often think about the mind is there's a small part of it, just as with an iceberg, that is above the surface of conscious awareness. And we have pretty good access to that part of it. When someone asks you a question and you respond, that response obviously is a direct reply to whatever they asked you. That is all above the surface of conscious awareness. But there's a ton of stuff going on below the surface. And this book is about that stuff below the surface. So I'm interested in focusing on that huge chunk of the iceberg below the surface of conscious awareness, the stuff that we don't have access to via direct introspection. And that's what this book is about. So what I try to do in the book is I try to say, here is this edifice of iceberg. How can we populate it with information? Like, what is actually making our minds what they are and forming our decisions and our thoughts and our actions? And how can we say, this little chunk of the iceberg, what's causing that? It's these things. And so I'm trying to explain what that iceberg is. And I go through in the book a whole lot of different forces that are shaping us that make the iceberg what it happens to be. So just to move away from that metaphor, I'm going to tell you now more about the title. Drunk Tank Pink is actually a colour. And it's this very bright bubblegum, Pepto-Bismol, amoxicillin colour that reminds people of their childhoods when they were taking horrible medication. And the origin of the colour it's about now 40 years old since it was first identified. There were two researchers in Canada, and they were very curious about how they could improve behaviour in classrooms, reduce truancy rates. And so what they did was they went to classrooms all around Canada, and they started to paint those classrooms different colours. And it was an exercise in exploration. They weren't really sure which colours would be most effective and which ones would perhaps be less effective. They had lay theories about which ones would work and which ones wouldn't. And so they painted different classrooms different colours. And they measured the effects on the students. Were they better behaved? Were they smarter? Did they seem to give better contributions? It was reasonably unscientific. It wasn't done with a very, very careful hand, but I think it was a useful enterprise because it started a new movement. And what they found was that blue was pretty good sometimes. It pacified people a little. It reminded the kids of the sky and the ocean. Green reminded them of nature. Yellow made them a little bit more vibrant. It's hard to know exactly whether all that stuff is true or whether the researchers expected to see that in the students. But one thing they found that they were pretty certain of was that this colour pink lulled the students and pacified them. And they were much better behaved. They were more quiet, a little bit more thoughtful. And so they became more curious about this colour pink, and instead of investigating all the colours further, they thought, let's try and do a more careful scientific exploration of what this colour pink does to people. And so in one of the experiments, a researcher, Alex Schaus, wanted to see whether he could make strong adult males weaker, pacify them with this colour pink, simply by using a colour. So what he did was he ran an experiment with this tool, which is called a hand grip dynamometer. Sounds like a tool of Scientology, but it's simply a device that measures how hard you grip with your hand. And so what he did was he had a group of 153 healthy male subjects. They walked into the room, and he held up the piece of cardboard in front of them. And half of them saw the blue cardboard first, half saw the pink cardboard first. But what he did was he said to them, I want you to stare at this cardboard for a minute. They stood staring at the cardboard, and then he said, I want you to grip this dynamometer as hard as you can. And he measured how much force they could exert with their hands after staring at the pink cardboard. And then after doing that, they did it again, this time with the blue cardboard. And you can see why he needed to counterbalance which one they saw first, because you're obviously generally weaker after doing it once. And the results were pretty striking. So what he found was that of the 153, 151 of them, or 98.7%, were stronger after looking at the blue cardboard rather than the pink cardboard, which is a pretty striking result. All they're doing is staring at a piece of cardboard. And we're constantly exposed to a world of colour. And this suggests that with the right colour, you can engineer behaviour, or at least tweak behaviour in certain directions. And so this was a striking effect, and he took this effect on the road and he started to talk about it. It gained currency. He was on American talk shows. And one of the things he found was that people in the prison industry, the prison guards were very interested in this effect. So one of the things they were very curious about was how they could pacify the prisoners. And so he came across two people who were working at a naval prison in Seattle named Baker and Miller. And that's where the colour's other name, Baker Miller Pink, comes from. And what they did was they painted the inside of one of their drunk tanks, which is where the name comes from, this bright pink colour. And they reported that over the following 9 months, there was not a single person who emerged from that chamber still aggressive, even though when they threw them in there, they were aggressive. And so putting them in this drunk tank pink coloured cell for 15 minutes, they argued, completely pacified them. And it also gained currency in other arenas. So one other thing that happened was coaches at a number of football teams, at a number of colleges, decided that they would paint the visiting locker rooms this colour. And so you can obviously understand what they were thinking. The reasoning was that by painting the visiting locker rooms this colour, you would pacify your opponents. And at halftime, they would sit in there. They would have gone in ready for the next half. They will come out obviously a lot weaker. And that's how the theory went. The NCAA wasn't impressed, and they mandated for a little while that you had to paint both colours, both locker rooms the same colour. And so they had to paint these white. But it turns out that the University of Iowa still has one locker room that's painted this colour. You can see it's not just the paint, it's the colour of everything, the lockers, the urinals, the carpets. So this is the origin of drunk tank pink. And it's the opening anecdote that I discuss in the book. And the whole book is about these cues. So colour is just one of the 9 cues that I talk about in the book. I'm going to touch on a few others here today, just to give you a sense of what populates the book and what I think populates that range of forces that shape how we think, feel, and behave. I'm going to talk about them in 3 different ways. The first is the stuff that just resides inside our heads, the information in our heads that shapes us. So this is the world, I call this the world inside us. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the world between us. So the fact that we're a social species is actually very important for all sorts of behaviours. And I'm going to talk about how the interactions we have with other people influence our behaviours. And then at the end, this is where colour would come in. I'm going to talk about the physical world, or the world around us. You can see these cues get broader and broader and broader as we go out from the narrow ones, the world inside us. So starting with the world inside us, I'll talk a little bit about the effect of names. And in the world of cognitive psychology and social psychology, some experiments have been done to look at how we feel about different letters of the alphabet. And it turns out that if I ask all of you to look at this array of letters, just think about whether you have some favourite letters there. It's not a question you're asked very often. There's not a lot of content in letters for you to latch onto so that you feel that one is more, that you like one more than the other. Maybe you like one shape more than the other. But one fairly robust piece of evidence suggests that we are 50% more likely to circle the letters that are associated with our names, especially the first letter. So me, as Adam Alter, I'm very likely to circle A, and I do feel a strange kinship with the letter A. And this is true across a whole lot of different countries and languages and alphabets. It doesn't just have to be done with the English alphabet or the English language. And it's been shown pretty robustly across a whole lot of different alphabets and groups. But of course, we do more than just name people. We also name things like hurricanes. So if you look at these 2 images here, these are Hurricane Katrina and Rita from the very devastating 2005 Atlantic hurricane season. And the way we identify hurricanes as a matter of convenience is we go down the alphabet and we pick different names for them. And what we used to do before the 1950s, when the Weather Service got involved, we used to just say this is hurricane latitude this, longitude that, and it was very hard to keep track of them. And so we now use these names as a matter of convenience. And one of the questions in this book that I ask is, does it matter what we name these hurricanes? Based on the fact that we know that people are attracted to their initials, does that matter? So another way of putting this is, if you had 2 hurricane relief teams that you were putting together made up of celebrities, would it matter whether the green group was the team that was trying to raise funds after Katrina or after Rita, or whether you chose the blue group to raise for one or the other? Should that matter? And if you look at these celebrities, if you think about them, can anyone notice a difference or something that marks the green team as one group and the blue team as another group? K versus R names, which is especially true for Kevin Kline and Ryan Reynolds. So all the people in the blue group happen to have R names, and all the people in the green group have K names. And it turns out that this actually does matter. So there's some pretty good evidence that after Hurricane Katrina, people whose names began with K donated about 2.5 times more to that charity than they did to any other charities that weren't K related. And the same for Rita. In fact, it was an even stronger effect. 3.6 times more to Hurricane Rita relief than to non-R hurricane relief. Now, we should be able to use that. That implies all sorts of interesting things. One thing it implies is that we should consult the demographic makeup or the name makeup in the US to decide how to name our hurricanes. We shouldn't be doing this randomly. So if you look at the way names are distributed in the population of the US now, what you find is that some letters are more represented than others. So there are many more J names and M names and A names and R names than there are O names or V names or Y names. And so that suggests that we should perhaps be naming our hurricanes a little bit differently. And I'll explain why that is. The other thing we could do is perhaps take some letters out of our loop. And instead of naming hurricanes Oscar, Olga, and Omar, as we do every few years, these are from different hurricane lists that cycle through each year, perhaps we should leave the letter O out altogether. And if you look at this year, this is the list of hurricane names that we'll be going through, from Andrea to Barry to Chantal. You can see it's 20 different names picked from the different letters of the alphabet. And that's going to be true for all the other years. We have 6 different lists that we cycle through. And if you focus on this list this year, let's try and work out whether this is an optimal list. Is this how we should be naming our hurricanes this year? If people identify with their names, perhaps with their initials, perhaps they also identify with their names. And so the same principles should work. And so if we look at these names and do the same thing, we look at how common these names are in the population, I'm representing the commonness of these names by how large the font is. So Karen and Melissa and Jerry are quite common as names go. Andrea is pretty common. But a lot of the other names here are completely underrepresented. So if people are going to donate more to hurricane relief charities when the hurricane happens to share their name or their initial, then perhaps we're not doing this as well as we could. And you could optimize this better. So one thing that you could do, I've now changed the scale of that slide. This is on the same scale as this newly rescaled slide. These names are the best names we could pick for each letter, the most common names with each letter in the US population. So if what we're trying to do is maximize the number of people who see these names and think something, it drives them to give a little bit more, we could be doing much better than the names that you have on this current list. We could pick these names, and we would tap into the sentiments of many, many more people in the American population. And in fact, if you look across the last 12 or 13 years at the 27 most damaging hurricanes and how much relief they attracted, what you find is that the actual donations were around $10 billion in the relief aid funds. If you remove this name letter effect, this tendency for people to be drawn to their initials and to give more, had that effect not operated, people would have only given about $9.5 billion. So we would have had about $500 million less in aid donation than we actually had. If we'd optimized this and picked exactly the right names, we would have attracted an extra 7% or $700 million. This is a completely cost-free innovation. It's not even an innovation. It's just a matter of changing the names of these hurricanes. It costs the government nothing. The National Weather Service doesn't pay much to change names. We know that this year the Weather Channel has started naming winter storms. They've started naming them things like, terrifying names like Nemo and Sandy. And of course, the storms are devastating, but the names are sort of picked reasonably randomly. And the suggestion here is that if you really want people to engage with these names, you should obviously pick the names a little more carefully. So this is just one effect. The question is, what should you look for in a name when you're picking names? This is a slightly different stream of research, but it's a pretty common question. How should I name things myself? The first factor that's very, very important is the fluency of the name. How easily can you pronounce the name? There's a lot of research that's been done on this question. So the test we give people is to determine how fluent a name is. We ask them, imagine that you're at the Oscars. You've opened the envelope and you're about to pronounce this name. How easy or difficult is that for you? Another way of thinking about it is that this is known as the 191 variants of Catherine test. So it turns out there are a lot of variations on the name Catherine. These are some of them. And some of them are easier to pronounce than others. And so we have, for example, Katrina is pretty easy to pronounce. This is also pronounced Katrina, but it's not as easy to pronounce based on what you're reading. This is also Katrina, very, very difficult to pronounce. And so these are different ways of writing the same name. And the argument here is you could just pick the simplest name, and that would be the best name to go with. And this actually does matter in the real world. This stuff does matter, and I've run some analyses looking at law firm partnership. How long does it take people to rise up the ranks in a law firm to become partner? And what I'm showing you here is how long it's been since these people graduated from law school. And obviously one of the big things people want to achieve is partnership as quickly as possible, for obvious reasons. If we separate all the lawyers in my sample, it was a number of thousands of lawyers, into those who had disfluent names determined by the Oscar test and those that had fluent names determined by the same test, after 3 years, none of them are partners yet. None of them were prodigies to that extent. But after 8 years, you find that there's a gap. The fluently named lawyers have become partners slightly more quickly. After 12 years, that gap persists. But after 16 years, the gap has closed, which suggests that these people are not, there's no difference in ultimate ability. It's not like the disfluently named lawyers will never become partner, but they become partner much more quickly when they have fluent names. And so that's what this suggests. We control for a whole lot of factors. Like one of the questions people have is maybe it's about outgroups and foreignness and ethnicity and stuff like that, and you can control for that. So if you get the pictures of all of these lawyers from the web, you can just pick the people who have Anglo names, who are white-skinned, who are male. So take the absolute in-group, and you find that the effect persists, even when you just look at those groups. And so these names have serious implications for various real-world behaviours. Here's another one. We looked at some financial stock performance data. So on this vertical axis here, you have the expected change in price based on the modelling that we did after just 1 day, when the stock has been trading for only 1 day. And on the x-axis, on the horizontal, you've got how easy it is to read the company's name, from very, very easy to very difficult. I'll give you some examples of those in a second. But this is what you can expect from the data, that if you name your stock with a very easy name, you can expect a bump on average of 14% after just 1 day. If you name it with a very hard name, you can expect the price of the stock to decline by 15%. And you can see this continuum. It's a pretty powerful effect. Just by choosing a different name, and we control for as many different things as we can to isolate this fluency construct. And the effect, as you can see, is pretty powerful. And here are 2 examples. Capital American, that was one of the easiest to pronounce names. That rose by 17%. And this Hungarian telecommunications company, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, is bust. It doesn't exist anymore. And it didn't really take in the American market. Of course, there are home biases as well. We know when we invest in stocks that we have a strong preference for the home stocks. We prefer those to the foreign stocks. So that's operating as well. But even if you take out the Hungarian telecommunications company and you just focus on American stocks, you find the same effect for domestic stocks. So this fluency construct really matters. And it makes people feel better about these stocks. We can talk more about the mechanism if you have questions about it, why this happens, what is the psychology behind it. But people feel better about these stocks, they perceive greater value, and I can talk more about that afterwards if you're curious. Another thing to look for in names is the symbolism in the names. So this is from a classic study run in the 1930s. If I said to you one of these shapes is a maluma, which one do you think is a maluma? Just call out left or right. Okay, so almost everyone agrees that maluma is the curvy shape on the left. Tekedi, you probably think of as the shape on the right. Buba is the shape on the left. Kiki is the shape on the right. We have a match in our minds between the sound that a particular word makes and how that should look. If I asked you to do it the other way around and I said, draw a buba for me, or a kiki, or a tekedi, or a maluma, you will draw shapes that are like this. I have a friend who named his child, her middle name is Maluma because he wanted people to see her as warm and round and sweet and feminine. So people actually do use these effects. And these also have major implications as well. This is something else, in addition to fluency, you should look for in a name. So Takedi is seen as a more masculine name than Maluma. And there's a hypothesis known as the Portia hypothesis, which suggests that Portia was a lawyer in The Merchant of Venice who had to dress up as a man so that she could appear before the court. And it's very sad that these effects exist, but some researchers looked at the rise of lawyers to the position of judge in South Carolina. And they looked at every name of all the female judges and all the people who hadn't become judge as well. And they wanted to look at whether there was an overrepresentation of female judges with masculine names. And it turns out there is. So you can classify every single name according to how masculine or feminine it is. So if 99% of people with that name happen to be male, that's a very male name, obviously. And so you have names like Tom, where that's the case, and Jennifer, where that's the case. But then you have some names, Leslie, Kim, where you have obviously people who have that name. Some of them are male and some of them are female. And the Portia hypothesis suggests that people take this very seriously when they make judgments, that even the name you choose, the masculinity or femininity of that name, can shape how quickly or whether you become a judge in the legal system. So there are many more female judges with male names, or disproportionate number of them. This is also true commercially. If you look at a lot of companies, and actually Google falls under this banner, I'll explain why in a second, the K sound, the hard K, from Kellogg's and Coca-Cola and Cat and Costco, and the same plosive sound, the G sound in Google, this applies to that sound as well. Those hard sounds also have the same sort of masculinity as Takedi, or the strength associated with those names. And what you find is that if you look at the top 200 companies, this was an analysis done quite a while ago, but if you look at the top companies, these are the companies out of the top 200 that have, so I think it's 38, I think it's about 38 of them have K, that hard K sound at the beginning of their names, and a lot more have that sound in their names. And if you look at all the words in general or names in general in the English language, only 7% of all names and 4% of all words begin with that sound. So there's an overrepresentation of these K words or K names in high-performing companies. In fact, Eastman, when he created the company Kodak, decided to name it Kodak. The apocryphal tale is that he named it Kodak because the sound was mimicking the sound of the shutter. That he thought it went Kodak when you snap the shutter. Turns out he actually just really liked this hard beginning and hard end. He thought that Kodak sounded powerful and dominant, and he picked for that very reason that name. So that's just a sampling from the first section. I'm going to zip through the second section very quickly now and talk a little bit about stuff that doesn't just reside in our heads, but also how we interact with other people. And that's the world between us. I'm just going to give you one quick example here. This is Vladislav Karchov. He's a chess grandmaster. He's also one of the world champions at Blitz chess, 60-second games of chess. And his 2009 world rank was 58. He's a very impressive chess player. But he also is known, and better known, because sometimes he turns up to matches drunk and has fallen asleep on occasion during matches. And also, he's known as the playboy of chess because he created the World Chess Beauty Contest. And he decided that all female chess players who are grandmasters should submit photos of themselves into a beauty contest. And one question some researchers had on the back of this is, does this actually matter? I mean, it's offensive, obviously. But does it matter? Does it matter if you are an attractive female playing chess? Does that change how people play against you? This is Carmen Cass. She was the model for Christian Dior's J'adore perfume. She also happens to be one of the best chess players in Estonia, and she was the head of the Estonian Chess Federation. So the question is, when you're playing Carmen Cass, if you're a hot-blooded heterosexual male, does it matter that you're playing Carmen Cass rather than someone else who's making the same moves, the identical moves? Now, these people playing against Carmen Cass are experts. They are very, very good chess players. They don't make moves randomly. They've thought a lot about the moves they're making, and they've probably come across similar games in the past. They're very advanced players, and they also should be hyper-rational. They should be about as rational as humans are. But some researchers looked at how people react when they play against these players who are more or less attractive. These are not images that I created. This is from the website Hot or Not. And you can take an average of all the faces that get low ratings and high ratings, and that's what you get. The question is, would it matter playing chess against these different people? And the research shows that if you look at all the games among grandmasters from 97 to 2007, this effect applies for heterosexual males who are playing against women. You find that when they play against the slightly less attractive players, you get many more conservative draws. They play a more conservative game. They're a little bit more careful about what they're doing. Their moves are not quite as risky or extravagant. But when they play against an attractive woman, they make many more risky moves. Both their opening moves, the opening gambit, they tend to select a much more risky one, almost as though in evolutionary terms they're trying to impress the woman who's in front of them with their daring. But then they end up losing many more games. You also find that the moves, so not just the opening gambits, but also the moves throughout the game and the outcomes of the games, they tend to win very in a spectacular fashion, or to lose, to bomb in a spectacular fashion. And people have commented that it's striking to watch my friend play this game. He's never played a game like that before. And often that happens when he's playing against a very attractive female. And there's a lot of research showing the same thing, that we are swayed by the people around us in all sorts of unexpected ways. So even the most rational of us can be swayed by the people who are around us. So that's focusing a little bit on the world between us. There's a lot more to that, but I want to quickly jump over to the world around us. This is where colour comes in. I'm going to look at a different cue, though, instead of looking at colour. And that's the power of nature to be a barrier between us and some stressor. So there's some fascinating research that was conducted at Paoli Memorial Hospital in Lancaster in Pennsylvania. And this was a group of people who were recovering from gallbladder surgery in the late 70s and early 80s. And there were 24 of them in each group. And they were basically very similar people. There wasn't much to distinguish them. They were similar in terms of their smoking history, their exercise history, their weight. Other health indicators were very similar. So for example, if you take patient 24 from each group, they were matched. Each one was yoked to someone similar. So we have a male who's about 24 or 25, smokes a similar number of cigarettes, doesn't exercise. And each of these you could match up. So there's no, going into this procedure, there's no difference. This is a map of the hospital from above. And what you have here is the rooms. And the rooms look out onto this area in a courtyard in the hospital. So these are the rooms where people recover from gallbladder surgery. And they're randomly assigned to different rooms. They get the same treatment from the same doctors, the same nurses. There is no real difference except where they happen to be located. What's kind of interesting, though, is some of these rooms happen to look out directly onto a stand of trees, whereas the other ones look out onto a brick wall. And you can see how that would be. So group 1, these look out onto a brick wall. And group 2, these look out onto a stand of trees. It's the only difference between these rooms. Everything else is the same, except the view. So this is effectively what they see out their windows. And the researchers wanted to know, and this is a paper published in the journal Science, does the presence of nature through the window, the image of nature, change how these people recover? And it does. It has remarkable effects. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of the dimensions. If you look at the recovery period, days 2 to 5, that's typically where people are struggling the most because the anesthetic has completely worn off and they haven't yet fully recovered. You find that people in group 1 who were looking at the brick wall needed about 6.5 doses of very heavy pain medication. People in group 2 needed only 3 doses. No difference going in. The only difference is the view. The same is also true about how long they stay in hospital. So it does take some time to recover, but by the time you get to day 6, you find that a gap starts to open up. That people who are looking at nature seem to recover more quickly. And if that continues on throughout day 6, 7, 8, and so on, by day 8, half of the patients who are looking at this view, this beautiful view, have, well, it's not even a beautiful view, it's just a couple of trees. Half of them have left. They've recovered. Whereas the group looking at the brick wall are still, many of them are convalescing in the hospital. And so on, so that by day 10, you've still got 6 patients from group 1 who are in the hospital staring at a brick wall. If anyone wants to get out quickly and is motivated to leave, it's those people. And yet the presence of nature through the window was enough to accelerate the recovery of these other patients. Now, this is a small-scale study. This isn't thousands of patients, but there have been many, many replications. I'll talk about just one of them. Actually, I won't have time to talk about it now, but there's at length. But there's another one looking at what happens to children who have difficult childhoods, either because they're bullied or because they have trouble at home. And it turns out that those who have very difficult childhoods and endure a lot of stress, one barrier that makes them capable of coping with that stress is whether there happens to be incidentally some nature around, whether they play sports in green areas. And some very careful analyses were done, and the researchers showed, for example, that the ones who lived in a home with lots of pot plants, who happened to live near greenery rather than an urban concrete environment, were much more likely to still be okay. They were happier about themselves, they had higher self-esteem, they succeeded at school, just because there appeared to be some natural environment around them. So nature is a very powerful buffer against stress. Another effect in locations that I think is really interesting is the effect of noise. Does anyone recognize this? This is New York City. It's a part of Manhattan. It's the only place where a large interstate freeway goes through, a highway goes through Manhattan. Does anyone recognize that? Yeah, it's the George Washington Bridge where it comes into Washington Heights. And this is I-95, obviously one of the busiest, most densely packed highways in the US. And the question was, for people who happen to live near this highway, what's the effect on these people? And the area that I've circled in red here, there's a series of tall, high-rise buildings. They're all identical, and they happen to be situated directly on top of the freeway, known as the Bridge Tower apartments. These are the apartments from the side, and they're about 32 stories high. And one thing you can do is you can measure the sound, the level of sound, the ambient sound at each of these different levels. So you find, for example, that obviously there are different levels as you go up because it gets softer as you go higher. At the first level, if you happen to live on the ground floor, the background noise is 86 decibels, which is about what you'd expect. You're near a freeway, it's the sound of a truck going by. That's a pretty serious noise. At the 8th level, the sound drops to 66 decibels, which is obviously quite a lot lower. It's a logarithmic scale, so it's about 100 times less sound. I think that's right. And it's basically like being in the presence of a loud vacuum cleaner. As you go up at level 20, it's like being in a crowded department store with people humming and chatting. And then by level 32, it's much, much softer. It's what you would hope, what you'd hope your home would sound like. It's only 55 decibels, which is less than the sound of very light chatter. So this is a family sitting around enjoying the fireplace. And it turns out that there's a very big difference between this first floor and the 32nd floor. There's a huge difference in the amount of sound that enters the ears of the people who live there. One of the questions the researchers asked was, what does this mean for people who live there? Especially if they have kids, does this matter? And so what they did was they approached people who lived in these different floors, on these different floors, and they asked their children various questions. So one of the questions they asked was, can you discriminate between these different sounds? So this child here was asked, what is the word that's being spoken? And they heard the word in their ears. And the word was either beer or gear. And they were asked, which word did you hear? And then they would do another one, robe and rope. And they went through a series of these. And they're designed, these are the sounds for us when we hear them that are the most confusable. And they were asked what word was being said. Now, most people with great hearing can achieve this 100% of the time. As long as the diction is clear, you should be able to distinguish robe from rope. And what they found was that was true for people who were very high up. These kids did very well on the test. They passed with flying colours. The kids who happened to live on the 20th floor, some errors crept in. Kids who lived on the 8th floor, more errors crept in. So from 100% down to 95 to 88, which suggests that their hearing has been damaged a bit from living in this area, in these different, on these different levels with different ambient noise. What's more distressing then is a lot of how we learn to read is in making fine distinctions between sounds. And so what they did was they gave them reading tests. And if you standardize the score so that the kids who lived on the top floor get a score of 100, the kids on the 20th floor scored a 93, and those on the bottom floor scored an 87. This is not about demographics, that wealthier people can afford to live higher up or anything like that. They made sure that that wasn't the cause of the effect. And so what you're seeing here is that just by living on a noisier floor of an apartment block, you can influence how well your kids learn to read and how quickly they learn to read, which is a striking effect. And what shows that this effect is due to this prolonged or chronic exposure to noise is that if you look at people who'd only lived there for much less time, for less than 4 years, the effect goes away. So if you look at their reading scores, these kids at the top floor scored 100, The ones on the 20th floor scored a 99 and the ones on the 8th floor scored a 98. It's about being there for a long time. So there is something you can do about it. If you're exposed to noise for a shorter period, the effects are less profound. So in a world of tiger moms and helicopter parenting, these are some very simple interventions that improve the lives of children and allow them to deal with stress more effectively than they might otherwise. The presence of nature, the sorts of activities they engage in, the absence of noise if at all possible, which is tricky in Manhattan, but it does suggest that of the constellation of features or cues that might shape your decision about whether to buy one apartment or another or to live in one apartment or another, maybe noise should factor in more than it does for a lot of us. So maybe it's nice to have a good view, but also another benefit of being higher up is it's going to be more quiet. And that's also an important factor. So I've sampled some anecdotes from throughout the book and some studies from throughout the book. I started by talking about names. It's the world within us. Then I moved on to the characteristics of other people in chapter 5. It's the chess players. And then I talked a little bit about locations when I talked about nature and the presence of noise. There's obviously quite a lot of other stuff in there as well. Drunk Tank Pink comes in at the beginning, but I talk a lot more about the effects of colours on all sorts of things like how well Olympic competitors seem to do. So if you have two competitors who are equally matched, in the Olympics we randomly assign them to wear either red or blue. It's just the way the Olympics approaches this question of how to decide what people should wear. It turns out those who wear red win much more often than those who wear blue. And that's especially true when they're evenly matched. It seems to tip the hand slightly in favour of the ones who wear red. And there are a number of reasons for this. Referees see people clad in red as more dominant, and so when they're awarding points, they award more points to people who wear red. So that's another one of the effects I discuss. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
What got you interested on this path of, I don't know what field you would call this, but whatever it is?
Yeah, so my background is in psychology, in social psychology and cognitive psychology, and those are the fields where you discover a lot of this stuff. And when I was an undergrad in Australia, I came across some of this research in an intro to psych class, and I was fascinated. I started working with some professors there. I started doing similar research when I went to grad school in the US. And I think there are two reasons why I wrote the book. One is because I find this stuff intrinsically fascinating, and I think other people tend to when I discuss it with them, and so I thought there was room to describe it more broadly. But I also think if you look at the hurricane example, there's good reason to talk about this stuff for policy reasons. Why shouldn't we name our hurricanes slightly differently? It costs us nothing, and in so doing we might attract more hurricane aid. It just seems like a no-brainer. So if we can capitalize on this stuff, there are no side effects to renaming our hurricanes, really. Some of the effects are great, and so from a policy perspective, there's a lot we can do that we aren't doing, and this book talks about some of those effects. So I think it's interesting, and because it has practical consequences. Yeah?
In terms of no negative effects for the hurricane, it could be a good thing to do, but I would wonder what the effect on people named Sandy is when Hurricane Sandy gets all this horrible press, and then similarly, if we name all the hurricanes after popular names, if that effect would apply more broadly.
Right, yeah. So the question was, what happens with, say, Hurricane Sandy? Once you happen to be named Sandy and a hurricane comes through, this is true for Katrina as well. There are negative externalities there, that it's horrible to be named after something that was a tragedy. So one argument there is maybe what we should do is pick a name that's uncommon, but with a letter that's very common. So that's, since most of the research focuses on the letters rather than the names, maybe we should pick the least common name with the letter that's most common. That's one answer. But you're right, there are always questions like that we should be juggling and throwing into the mix. It's not obvious that there are no externalities, but I think in general, in a lot of these cases, these interventions are so inexpensive. Another one is in Glasgow, Scotland, and in parts of Japan, they shone blue lights on certain parts of town. That reminded people of, presumably of police and of being watched, so they behaved much more honestly. The same is true with billboards. If you put up a billboard with eyes, a pair of human eyes, that costs very little, but it has the effect of making people feel like they're being watched. And there's good evidence to suggest that they are much more likely to behave honestly when there's a billboard with eyes around. The same is true with a mirror. If you happen to open a cupboard, if you have a cupboard with all your chocolates and you're trying to keep to a diet, put a mirror up, because every time you open it, you'll be staring into your soul as you reach in and try to grab the food that you're not supposed to be eating. So you're right. There are some externalities and some negatives, but generally speaking, I think the positives greatly outweigh the negatives. Hi, yeah.
I'm curious for the hospital example. How do you know that it's a difference between a beautiful and not beautiful view? So, for instance, what if you were looking at like a skyline view that was beautiful and like dead shrubbery? Like, how do you know it's nature and not just beautiful, or that eye level or beautiful view?
You're right. Yeah. So it could be. The question was, how do we know that it's not just beauty? How do we know that it's not just that one view is nicer than the other? Like, what if you had a really ugly natural view, or a really pretty view that's sculpted but it's concrete? And that's a great question, and it's not something you can address with that study. But a lot of other studies ask the same question. So in one study, people watched the most horrific video you can imagine of animals being put through an abattoir. It's a very distressing video, and it's a propagandist video that tries to get people to eat less meat, obviously. And they watched this video, and when they then performed various mental tasks, they did much worse on the task, as you'd expect. They were distracted and a little bit disturbed. And what they did with other people was they got them to walk through a beautiful natural environment, or a beautiful environment, or a very nice environment that wasn't natural. And they found in that experiment, even though the beauty of the two environments was rated equally highly, that only the natural environment had this positive effect. And one of the arguments is that one of the things that distinguishes a natural environment from a built environment, even if it's beautiful, is that a built environment is static. A natural environment, you have the rustle of wind through leaves, you have the movement of a river. All of that stuff is critical. And William James was one of the first and greatest philosophers and psychologists, not the first philosopher, but one of the first psychologists. He talked about two kinds of attention, and one of his arguments was that it's this kind of stuff that visits on you that you don't have to deal with. You don't have to dodge cars or remember things, that your attention is grabbed by nature and the movement of the wind through the trees and all of that stuff. That's a replenishing kind of attention, whereas it's very stressful to have to deal with the movement of cars and dodging traffic and all the stuff that we normally associate with stress. So there's something about the kind of attention that is drawn out of you from natural environments that has this effect beyond just beautiful environments that aren't natural. Yeah.
Just on the naming piece, have there been any studies that looked at the impact on politics or the way people vote?
Yeah, I actually, in the same paper on lawyers, I looked at that. We don't have real data sets. We haven't looked at real data sets on that. But we show that if you give people names of politicians and you ask them to rank them and rate them and vote on them, they like the ones who have simpler names. And there's one great anecdote that there were some politicians with surnames Hart and Fairchild. There's an article on Slate about this, and they did extremely well. They weren't expected to do all that well, and they outperformed. And they were up against someone whose surname was Paczynski, and it was hard to pronounce, a little bit hard to spell. And there was a whole argument that part of the problem there was that when people were saying, we should vote for Paczynski, they didn't even know what to say. They just said, we should vote for that candidate who had that name that I can't remember or pronounce. And that stuff ends up mattering, especially for the transmission of the name. So yes, there's been some research on that as well. Yeah.
On that note, are there any studies on different names, like people with the same name, but how nicknames are, whether they're viewed differently by others or by themselves? You know, if it's Cat versus Kate versus Katie or something like that.
I don't know of much research looking at nicknames as a distinct factor beyond names themselves. It's an interesting question because obviously Kat has, or Kate or Katrina has so many associated nicknames. It's a good question, which nickname should you pick? I think the main argument though is nicknames are a great idea when the name is especially complex, and you can simplify it by giving people a nickname to use. And you see that a lot of people with names that are hard to pronounce do this naturally anyway. But beyond the question of whether one nickname is simpler than another, I don't know about much research that's looked specifically at nicknames. It's a good question though.
This more is for the colors, if it works for anything. Have they found how much of this is evolutionary, genetic, long-term factor versus more social, short-term factors?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The question was how much of this is long-term versus evolutionary based on a very, very long time scale. How much of it is just based on association? That's a big question for colours. So with Drunk Tank Pink, we associate pink with femininity, which we haven't always done. So pink was a colour that we didn't associate with one gender or another until maybe 150 years ago. And the question is, would you have found the same effect then? There's some evidence either way. There's one study apparently that reports that even I'm colourblind, and apparently this effect even works on colourblind people. So I can't see that pink the way you all see that pink, assuming you're not colourblind. but it's supposed to have the same effect, which suggests something biological at least, beyond the level of pure association. So even if I think it's grey, it's still doing the same thing to me. But there are other studies that suggest that if you expect pink to make you stronger, the effect goes away. So maybe it's about the association. If you retrain people to have new associations, a lot of these effects go away. And that's actually a good question because it's a constant theme in the book that I talk about. Some of this stuff is very low level. It goes back well into the reaches of the past of early humans and how they interacted with each other. But a lot of it is really a product of the environment that we live in today. And a lot of it shows that the environment we're in today is not the one we were over time molded for or designed for. And so a lot of these little errors that creep in and biases that creep in are a product of that mismatch between the people we were molded to be in one environment and the fact that we haven't kept up enough with a very rapidly changing environment. So I suggest some ways that we might be able to cope better with that. Yeah.
Is there any data on whether the pacifying effect of pink affects men or women more?
There is data. There are some results, and it's slightly stronger with men than it is for women. There's one study that shows that women don't respond as much. That in general, they are much less sensitive to the colour than men are, which may suggest then, I guess, that to some extent the effect is about association. If men think of femininity, perhaps that then changes how they feel when they're gripping the hand grip, whereas women, maybe that it just loses that effect. So perhaps more, it's to some extent about the association there. Yeah. Thank you.